I must begin this video with the stamp of an apology. For what I am going to say might sound strange, harsh, and even improper to those who have ears for clarity, consistency, and simplicity. I must confess that I consider myself to be one of those people. So this apology is also addressed to myself. For if brevity is the soul of wit, then what I'm about to say will certainly not be very witty. That is the first crime for which I must sincerely apologize. I must also apologize for separate reasons for the vagueness and indirectness that I symptomatically adopt. As far as my subject matter is concerned, to be as direct as possible would be to say nothing at all. At the same time, because I am attempting to say something, there is a basic irreverence and imprudence involved here. To those whose ears have already picked up on what I want to express, and who are prepared to cross through this rough ground with me, I must ask them to be patient and forgiving. Not only because of the length of this video, but also because I fear that what I will say will be far too excessive, repetitive, and lacking in subtlety on the one hand, and on the other hand, far too tame, too conventional, and shot through with the banality of tautology. Such is the paradoxical and split nature of the subject. I will go ahead and try to speak then, even if what is said will be imperfect, incomplete, and even on the verge of nonsense. I hope, though, that if there is nonsense, it will be like the playful and innocent nonsense of the child who still lives on in every one of us. But I can only hope, because certain forms of nonsense are undoubtedly anything but innocent. Sometimes, silence is better than speaking. Without realizing it, speech often tends to cover up a naked truth, either out of shame or simply clumsiness. To speak without saying anything really meaningful, or to put forward a poorly formed question, to ramble on and on without getting to the point, all this noise and fury signifying nothing ends up obscuring precisely what makes all speech possible. Music is commonly considered to be a universal form of communication. It appears to have the ability to speak to us without words, without making sense per se, but also without being complete nonsense. In fact, our senses are sometimes filled with so much meaning when we listen to music that we seem to float beyond mere earthly existence and reach a realm of absolute truth and ideal transcendence. Through music, we can temporarily forget about the constant threat or possibility of a meaningless existence. The cruelty and harshness of a raw, savage, and brutal reality is gently drowned out by the calming and serene melody of a distantly familiar song. No matter how amateur or unskilled the musician is, music always lures us better than speech. But insofar as it hides, conceals, and filters its origins, insofar as it anesthetizes and induces an impression or halo of meaningfulness, music is just as contingent and insufficient as speech, since it always depends upon a reality beyond it, which it does everything to make us forget. It does, however, give us something that speech cannot: a fulfilled and fulfilling meaning, which seems to emanate from within the very core of our being. Music fills our ears and also surrounds us. It encloses us within a sacred space. But the sacredness that we find within every form of architecture whose walls resonate with comforting sound is not simply positive. From the Egyptian pyramids to temples and cathedrals, every sacred space where music could be heard is organized around something essentially missing. Every vessel is essentially empty and betrays or marks an absent, vacated, and negative space, where something untouchable and unnameable, even profane, commands our respect. Sometimes we think we can name it, and perhaps we can, but we must show restraint when speaking of such a sacred thing. Would it be lacking in restraint to say at least this? Namely, that the sacred itself is nothing other than the presence of an absence. There we have it, the thesis of this video, the center of the discourse, or at least very close to it, the originary motivation for this all too serious essay. But what if this idea that the sacred itself is nothing other than the presence of an absence, what if it wasn't original? What if I were appropriating it to serve some other ulterior motive, without citation, and without the obligatory acknowledgement of intellectual debt? Wouldn't it be the highest imprudence and mark of absolute shamelessness to repeat such a formula without the slightest apprehensiveness? But how could one ever fully acknowledge one's intellectual debts? One's debt to the often overlapping and interconnected thoughts of so many others who have tried to express similar ideas. In a similar vein, how could music ever fully acknowledge its debt to silence? What if something about this idea really is authentically mine? And I'd like others to accept it by vaguely alluding to some great original thinker or the authority of wisdom itself, in order to convince those who might disagree. What if the hesitation and self-doubt I'm currently exemplifying is only for show, for the purpose of demonstration? Demonstration of what, exactly? In truth, and in all sincerity, it could only be one thing: the presence of the sacred, and therefore absent heart of silence. The impossible silence that goes undetected within all sound is structurally and functionally the same as that non-place that the pyramid's millions of stones serve to encase. This is just to say that every structure is constituted, organized, and founded precisely upon what would bring it down, what would call it into question or expose it to the possibility of ruin. We can go even further and say that every system or structure, every theory or architectonic project must include this threatening and destabilizing non-principle for practical and indeed religious reasons. As every great philosopher has always maintained, the swan song of philosophy is about learning how to die. But when the music ends, what could remain, save for the remains of the divine? The silence of the real, the grimace of the real of silence, the absence of a response to the overlushness of song. All this perhaps only touches upon the profound void that is so precariously and impiously invoked here. The pretense held by all music to distract us from this omnipresent lack of existence can only last temporarily. Sooner or later, we sober up. We come to realize that the entire orchestra, the entire orchestration of the audible world is only a kind of smokescreen for the terrifying otherness that haunts all carefully planned structures. The cold, unacknowledging, and therefore unacknowledged non-presence, embedded in both our churches and our heads, neither reacts nor responds to the sublimated aims of musical ambition. The security in the swaddling blanket of music rests in the fact that it will always falter, always come to a halt, precisely when it comes to expressing the most fundamental rhythm from which all rhythm is derived. A continuous and therefore uninterrupted non-rhythm with no beginning and no end, no feet. Precisely the definition of the impossible. The organizing principle in music and speech, which is not really a principle after all, is that of a burning desire to hear the impossible itself, even if it would destroy us. For if we could hear what this impossible silence has to say, what it yearns to get across, what it perhaps knows about us, maybe then it wouldn't be nearly as unsettling as it is. We might be able to understand the primordial enigma of existence. Why existence supplants non-existence. Why the death of God has yet to be heard and registered as the unprecedented event that it represents. We might learn the true origin of this order of things in which we live, which seems to have been preordained or destined to exclude certain unfathomable possibilities. But aren't we the ones who have been excluded? Aren't we the improbable ones cast out of a supposed paradise, where problems such as these would never have been possible? Isn't it because our world was spoken into existence, carved ex nihilo out of words and silent bodies, that we can only access the sacred core of our being indirectly, by means of signs and animal metaphors? Animals are as distant from us as paradise. For our distant ancestors, Animals served as the original model for the sacred. But is it proper to speak of distant ancestors, paradise, or of animals for that matter? Of animals together in a paradise, without conflict or violence? Has such a thing ever been? Could such a thing ever be? If it neither was nor could be, then how is it that we have never stopped dreaming of it? How could we avoid dreaming of it? If it is both impossible and unavoidably desirable, then the memory or promise of paradise would be at once that of absolute enjoyment and inescapable catastrophe. Harmony and disharmony. What the sacred exemplifies, above all, is a certain hyperbolic sovereignty, which relegates and banishes all centers and insides to the non-central outside. Like the heaviest star, it attracts all lesser bodies and threatens to either engulf and annihilate them, or else catapult them into an even vaster infinity. In every story, myth, or delusion, one can always find some mark or trace of the real that sustains it, but only that, a trace. No wonder we have to simply be content with orbiting the sacred, indefinitely, without touching it, as if it were the corpse of a dead god or animal. Out of the narrow confines of an interior of thought, composed and decomposed by noise, we can only hope to listen intently to the impossible and discern precisely why it has been rejected and condemned simply out of hand. But who has ears for that? Here enters the most banal of tautologies. All this irresponsible talk of impossible silence is just to say that we have never heard it, and we never could. Not only because the beating of our own heart would lure us into identifying its cessation with our so-called final destiny, but because the only way to hear is through silence, past it, through a halting of the drumming that goes on incessantly in our ears. Only when the beat of the hammer against the tympanum ceases do we even register a sound or a silence. In this sense, every pause and every break speaks volumes and carries more meaning than any purely positive, insistent pressure of intention. But truly silent silence, the impossible silence which carries no connotations and communicates absolutely nothing, silence which ferries nothing across the void but the void itself and implies nothing either about ourselves or the world, would be beyond all encounter. And yet, this impossible silence would also be the necessary basis, the foundation of everything we hear and don't hear, including the gaps between and within words and melodies. Perhaps it's always imprudence to try to speak about the secret, sacred heart of reality. But what if the secret doesn't lie within, but rather somewhere without? What if the fundamental secret of the naked truth of speech always escapes every form of centrality and inwardness. Isn't the truth of reality, or the reality of truth, always to be found somewhere other than what is merely said? All this talk, rooted in a constitutional hubris, just to say reality is marginal. Isn't it better sometimes not to speak?